The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the man standing in the center of the room, his hands cuffed, his posture defiant. He was tall, with a presence that seemed to fill the space around him, but it wasn't his height that caught everyone's attention. It was the way he carried himself, calm, unshaken, almost as if he knew something no one else did. Across from him stood Officer Linda Grayson, a veteran cop with a reputation for being tough, no nonsense, and some would say a little too quick to judge. Her sharp eyes bore into him, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen this before, she thought. Another case, another suspect, another day in the life of keeping the streets safe. But this time, something felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the air in the room seemed charged, like a storm waiting to break. The charges were serious: resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, disorderly conduct. The kind of charges that could land someone in jail for years. Officer Grayson had been the one to bring him in, and she was confident in her case. She had seen the way he had acted that night, the way he had refused to comply, the way he had fought back. She had seen it all before, and she wasn't about to let this one slip through the cracks. But as the judge called the court to order and the proceedings began, a strange feeling started to creep into the back of her mind. Something about the way the man looked at her, the way he smiled ever so slightly, as if he knew something she didn't. It was unsettling, and she couldn't shake it. The prosecution began their case, laying out the events of that night in meticulous detail. Officer Grayson took the stand, her voice steady as she recounted the arrest. She described the struggle, the way the man had resisted, the way he had shouted at her, the way he had seemed to be hiding something. She was confident, sure of herself, sure of her story. But as she spoke, she couldn't help but notice the way the man's lawyer was looking at her. There was something in his eyes, something that made her pause. It was almost as if he was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then it happened. The defense attorney stood up, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I would like to call a witness to the stand." The judge nodded, and the attorney turned to the man in cuffs. "Mr. Johnson, would you please step forward?" The man stood, his cuffs clinking softly as he moved. He walked to the stand, his eyes never leaving Officer Grayson's. There was something in his gaze now, something that made her stomach twist. She had seen that look before, but she couldn't place it, not yet. As he took the stand, the attorney began to question him. But it wasn't the questions that caught everyone's attention. It was the answers. The man spoke with a quiet confidence, his voice steady, his words measured. He talked about his life, his work, his family. He talked about the night of the arrest, the way he had been treated, the way he had been judged before he even had a chance to speak. And then, just as the tension in the room was reaching its peak, he dropped the bombshell. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I am not who you think I am." The room erupted in murmurs, the judge banging his gavel to restore order. Officer Grayson felt her heart skip a beat. What was he talking about? Who was he? The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small badge, holding it up for everyone to see. The room fell silent once more, the air thick with anticipation. "My name," he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong, "is Agent Marcus Johnson. I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Officer Grayson felt the color drain from her face. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of trick. But as she looked at the badge, as she saw the way the judge and the attorneys reacted, she knew it was true. The man she had arrested, the man she had been so sure was just another criminal, was an undercover FBI agent. And now, as the weight of what she had done began to sink in, she realized that this was far from over. The storm she had felt brewing earlier was about to break, and there was no telling what would happen next. The room was in chaos, the attorneys arguing, the judge trying to regain control. But Officer Grayson could barely hear any of it. Her mind was spinning, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made a mistake, a big one, and now she was going to have to face the consequences. But as she looked at Agent Johnson, as she saw the way he was looking at her, she knew that this wasn't just about her. This was about something bigger, something deeper. And as the gavel came down once more, signaling the end of the session, she realized that this was only the beginning. The real story was just about to unfold. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, but it did little to silence the murmurs that had taken over the room. Officer Linda Grayson sat frozen in her seat, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. Agent Marcus Johnson, the man she had arrested, the man she had been so sure was just another troublemaker, was an undercover FBI agent. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. How could she have missed it? How could she have been so wrong? Her eyes darted to the defense table, where Agent Johnson was now seated. His cuffs removed, his posture relaxed, but his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking at her anymore, but she could feel the weight of his presence, the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. The judge called for a recess, and the room began to empty, the buzz of conversation growing louder as people filed out into the hallway. Officer Grayson stayed where she was, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench in front of her. She needed a moment to think, to breathe, to figure out what the hell was going on. But before she could gather her thoughts, a voice broke through the noise. "Officer Grayson?" She turned to see a man in a dark suit approaching her, his badge clipped to his belt. He was tall, with a stern face and eyes that seemed to see right through her. "I'm Agent Daniels," he said, his tone formal but not unkind. "We need to talk." She followed him out of the courtroom, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. The hallway was crowded, but Agent Daniels led her to a quieter corner, away from prying eyes. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions," he began, his voice low, "and I'll do my best to answer them. But first, I need you to understand the gravity of the situation." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "Agent Johnson was working on a highly sensitive operation. Your actions have compromised that operation, and now we're dealing with the fallout." Officer Grayson felt a lump form in her throat. "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea who he was. He didn't identify himself." "He couldn't," Agent Daniels interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "That's the nature of undercover work. But that's not the issue here. The issue is that you acted on assumptions, and those assumptions have put lives at risk." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't just about you, Officer Grayson. This is about the people who were counting on Agent Johnson to keep them safe. And now, because of what happened, we're back to square one." She felt a wave of guilt wash over her, but beneath it was a growing sense of frustration. "I was doing my job," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I saw a man acting suspiciously, and I responded accordingly. If I had known—" "But you didn't know," Agent Daniels cut in, his tone sharper now. "And that's the problem. You didn't take the time to assess the situation fully. You acted on instinct, and now we're all paying the price." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm not here to crucify you, but you need to understand the consequences of your actions, and you need to be prepared for what's coming next." Officer Grayson's heart sank. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Agent Daniels hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There's going to be an investigation," he said finally. "Internal affairs, the FBI, maybe even the media. This is going to get messy, and you're going to be at the center of it. My advice? Get a lawyer, and be ready to answer some tough questions. She nodded, her mind spinning. An investigation. The media. This was going to follow her for the rest of her career, if she even had a career left. She thought about her. Years on the force, the sacrifices she had made, the pride she had taken in her work. And now, in one moment, it all seemed to be slipping through her fingers. As Agent Daniels walked away, Officer Grayson leaned against the wall, trying to steady herself. She needed to think, to figure out her next move. But before she could, she heard a voice behind her. "Officer Grayson?" She turned to see a young woman standing there, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "I'm with the press," the woman said, holding up a badge. "Do you have a moment to comment on what just happened in there?" Officer Grayson felt a surge of panic. The last thing she needed was to be caught on camera, trying to explain herself to the media. "No comment," she said quickly, pushing past the reporter and heading for the exit. She needed to get out of there, to clear her head, to figure out what to do next. But as she stepped outside into the bright sunlight, she realized that there was no escaping this. The story was out there now, and it was only a matter of time before it blew up. She thought about Agent Johnson, about the way he had looked at her in the courtroom. There was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. Was it anger, disappointment, or something else entirely? She didn't know, but she had a feeling that this wasn't the end. In fact, it felt like the beginning of something much bigger, something much darker. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from her partner, Mike. "You okay? Heard what happened? Call me." She stared at the screen for a moment, then slipped the phone back into her pocket without responding. She wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. She needed time to process, to figure out how she was going to navigate the storm that was coming. But even as she drove away from the courthouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following her, but the road behind her was empty. Still, the feeling lingered, a nagging sense of unease that she couldn't quite shake. Something was off, something she couldn't put her finger on, and as she turned onto the highway, she realized that this was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The question was, what was she going to do about it? And more importantly, what was Agent Johnson going to do? She had a feeling that the answers to those questions were going to change everything, but for now, all she could do was wait and hope that she was ready for whatever came next. Officer. Linda Grayson drove in silence, the hum of the engine doing little to drown out the chaos in her mind. The courthouse was behind her, but the weight of what had happened clung to her like a shadow. She replayed the scene over and over, Agent Johnson's calm demeanor, the way he had revealed his badge, the stunned silence that followed. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But this was real, too real, and the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed a black SUV parked a few houses down. It wasn't unusual for her neighbors to have visitors, but something about the vehicle felt off. She hesitated, her hand on the car door, before deciding to ignore it. Paranoia wasn't going to help her right now. She needed to focus. Inside, she dropped her keys on the counter and poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the silence only amplified the thoughts racing through her head. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her partner, Mike. She stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hey," she said, her voice tired. "Linda," Mike's voice was urgent. "I just heard. Are you okay? What the hell happened?" She sighed, leaning against the counter. "I don't even know where to start, Mike. I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was making the right call. But now everything's a mess." "Listen," Mike said, his tone softening. "You're a good cop. You've always been a good cop. This is just a bad situation, but we'll figure it out, okay? You're not alone in this." She wanted to believe him, but the doubt was already creeping in. "Thanks, Mike," she said quietly. I need some time to think." "Take all the time you need," he replied. "But call me if you need anything, seriously." She hung up and set the phone down, staring at the blank screen. Mike was right. She wasn't alone. But that didn't make the situation any less daunting. She thought about Agent Daniels' warning, about the investigation that was coming. She needed to be ready, but ready for what? What exactly was she up against? Meanwhile, across town, Agent Marcus Johnson sat in a dimly lit room, his face illuminated by the glow of a laptop screen. The room was sparse, with only a desk, a chair, and a few filing cabinets. It was a temporary setup, one of many safe houses he had used over the years. But this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't just dealing with the fallout of a blown operation. He was dealing with something much more personal. He scrolled through the files on his computer, his expression grim. The operation he had been working on, a deep-cover investigation into a powerful drug cartel, was in shambles. Months of work, countless hours of surveillance, and a network of informants had all been compromised because of one arrest. One mistake. And while he knew that Officer Grayson hadn't acted out of malice, that didn't change the fact that her actions had put lives at risk. His life, the lives of his team, and the lives of the people who had trusted him to protect them. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He had been in tough situations before, but this one felt different. This one felt personal. And as much as he tried to push the thought aside, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this than met the eye. Had he been set up? Was there someone on the inside working against him? Or was this just a case of bad timing and worse luck? His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his supervisor, Agent Harris. "We need to talk, ASAP." Johnson sighed. He knew what that meant. The higher-ups were already circling, trying to figure out how to contain the damage. And while he understood the need for damage control, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play here. Something no one was talking about. Back at her house, Officer Grayson sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. She had tried to distract herself with mundane tasks, laundry, dishes, anything to keep her mind off what had happened. But it was no use. The questions kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. Who was Agent Johnson, really? What had he been working on? And how had she managed to stumble into the middle of it? She thought about the black SUV she had seen earlier and felt a chill run down her spine. Was she being paranoid? Or was there really something to worry about? She got up and walked to the window, peering out through the blinds. The street was quiet, the SUV nowhere in sight, but the feeling of unease remained. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from a news app. She opened it and felt her stomach drop. The headline read, "Undercover FBI agent wrongly arrested by local police." The article was brief, but it was enough to make her heart race. The story was out there now, and it was only a matter of time before the media came knocking on her door. She sank back onto the couch, her mind racing. She needed to do something, but what? She couldn't just sit here and wait for the storm to hit. But what could she do? She thought about calling Mike, about reaching out to someone for help, but she didn't even know where to start. As the hours passed, the tension in the room grew thicker. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the walls. Officer Grayson sat in the growing darkness, her thoughts a tangled mess. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot, and somewhere in the shadows, someone else was watching, waiting, planning. The game was far from over, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. But for now, all anyone could do was wait. and hope they were ready for whatever came next.